I didn't choose this, nor do anyone else. The thought that someone would belittle me because of a sexual orientation is the discrimination. You know, there are a few things you can choose to be. You can choose to be racist. You can choose to be anti-Semitic. You don't choose to be gay. Trust me, it's not a fun experiment.
As we welcome you into Hour 2 of America's Forum with Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth. That was my old congressional colleague, Mark Foley, on this program yesterday, part of a discussion on the religious freedom laws passed in Indiana and elsewhere.
Yeah, J.D., you missed a very powerful interview. He had a lot of strong things to say in regards to that law and just changes in general about same-sex marriage and what's been going on in the Republican Party.
But from the personal to the political,
Right.
Mark and I used to run for re-election every 2 years, so we know how things can carry political challenges. And let's talk some about the challenge confronting Republican presidential candidates in 2016 in terms of this law and people's stance on this. Matt Towery there, Skyping in from Atlanta, Georgia, part of Insider Advantage. Give us the insider scoop. As I understand it, a handful of potential 2016 candidates have come out in support of these religious freedom laws. Senator Rand Paul, announcing his candidacy yesterday, has also been open about opposition to gay marriage in the past, offering a no comment on the situation in Indiana. Matt, does that stance help in the primaries but hurt in the general election?
Well, J.D. and Miranda, first of all, it's interesting. We published a Southern Political Report, and I'm looking at candidates Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Rubio, Bush, potentially Lindsey Graham, all coming out of the South. So it's not a surprise without Walker and Trump and a few others who aren't from the South. I guess Trump stays from Florida. It's not surprising that we're seeing some of these evangelical issues pop back up. This overall issue of the religious freedom bills, which we've seen in Arkansas and other states. Georgia recently considered it. They chose not to pass it this year, but it will come back next year. Will play a role in these presidential campaigns, but I don't believe it will be a critical role. I think you're ultimately going to see these races turn into other issues that are more pocketbook oriented or more foreign policy oriented, as the nation's attention turns really to those sort of issues to determine who their nominee will be.
What do you think are going to be the top hot button issues for the 2016 election for Republicans?
Well, you know, it's interesting, Miranda. 4 years ago, obviously, it was the economy. This year, it's going to be, if it stays on track, foreign policy as a major issue. We have a huge problem right now with a White House that appears to have quote-unquote gone rogue. And you're seeing members of the U.S. Senate who at one time were considered very moderate, all signing letters basically protesting the president's move, and letters that were made open to foreign governments. That's something you've not seen before, an invitation by the Speaker of the House for the head of another nation, that being, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, without much involvement of the White House. These are things that we've not seen in the past, so it tells you that geopolitical issue, the overall stability of the Middle East, some of the other issues that come out of that are going to become far more important than they were 4 years ago.
And Matt, we're going to talk more about foreign policy after the break, but first, back to these social issues. Let's take a gander at some poll numbers in a poll conducted by NBC News and Marist College. Among likely 2016 GOP primary voters and caucus goers, it's interesting, the caucus state of Iowa looks like there's a plurality of Republicans okay with gay marriage, but the situation is reversed both in New Hampshire in the Northeast and South Carolina. They're obviously in the southeastern United States. So a case-by-case basis where in a primary situation, social issues will reign supreme. Got about a minute 30 remaining in this segment, Matt.
Okay, JD, I think what we're talking about here is the resurgence of the evangelicals. And those who remember the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, the secret to that election in part was not only Jimmy Carter, but it was also that the evangelicals were first really harnessed into a power. They used, at then, very modern techniques. They're not modern now, but get out the vote calls, direct mail, which was sort of a new thing at that time. And I think we're beginning to see the evangelicals come back out. They were out of the business for a little while. They didn't play a big role in either the McCain or the Romney nomination. But I think you're going to see that as a much more potent factor as we go into these early primaries and as we go into these southern primaries that will all vote at about the same time.
And evangelicals, does that mean Mike Huckabee and Dr. Ben Carson, or the youthful trio in the Senate? We've got about 30 seconds left.
Well, I think it means all of them, and they may actually split that vote up. Back when Mike Huckabee won in 2008 in Iowa, there was really just Mike Huckabee and no one else that really fit that level. Now you have a whole number of candidates who could claim that crown.
Well, fair enough, Matt Towery. Tell you what, stay right there, because when we come back, we're going to talk more about presidential politics in 2016, what's going to motivate voters, what might keep them at home. You stay at home and keep watching our program. We're coming right back.
I think so often we get people who are elected and they spend decade after decade up there. They lose touch with the people, and then nothing changes. We elect Republicans that say, we want Republicans to balance the budget, and then Republicans do the same thing the Democrats do. The last couple of Republicans we put forward, I couldn't tell you what we were for.
Senator Rand Paul, now a candidate for president, there talking to Fox News with Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth, back with you on America's Forum. Let's continue our conversation with Matt Towery of Insider's Advantage. And Matt, a whole lot of buzz about what direction the GOP might take or should take in 2016. You touched on foreign policy before the break. And of course, policy is formulated by people who are going to run and people who may be reviewing their past positions. For example, the case of Senator Rand Paul. Let's listen to what Senator Paul is now saying about foreign policy.
We're talking about electing someone who would be in charge of our nuclear weapons, someone who has their finger and able to launch nuclear weapons. You don't want somebody who wants to be at war in 15 countries and who thinks that war is always the answer. You want somebody who believes, as Reagan did, in peace through strength.
So, Matt, is Rand Paul redefining Ronald Reagan there, or trying to cast himself as the true heir to the Reagan legacy?
Well, you know, if I had a dollar for every candidate in the last 20 years or so who's tried to be Ronald Reagan, we could have a great meal somewhere in D.C. For all three of us. But in this case, there is some similarity. When Reagan ran in 1980, Reagan was viewed, as you recall, as sort of a nuclear cowboy. He was portrayed as a wild man who would hit the red button at any moment, blow the world up. That turned out not to be the case. In this instance, Rand Paul is having to eat some earlier words that suggest that he's an isolationist, doesn't want to be involved in anything with regard to foreign policy. He's now moving in the direction of saying, oh, I will deal with foreign policy, but I'm not a quote-unquote neocon, which is what is used to describe the George W. Bush era, and of course is trying to be imputed to Jeb Bush. So he's trying to straddle the fence. I actually think that we need to watch Rand Paul very carefully, because he has, and he inherits from his father, a very dedicated group of individuals who will turn out. And as you know, JD, in every election, particularly when you get into these early primaries, it's the turnout machine that somehow shocks everyone in states like Iowa, New Hampshire in particular, those early states, small states where turnout can matter. And Rand Paul may just have a recipe to be more important in this presidential campaign. I think it's inside the Beltway are thinking right now.
And he's also been pushing really hard over the last few years to gain the black vote. Is it paying off for him? Do you think it will?
Well, you know, again, if I had a dollar for every Republican in the last 20, 25 years who thought they were going to get the black vote, we could really go out and have a great meal. They've never gotten it. It takes more than a candidate. I know that's a great outreach effort, and I certainly applaud it. I'm not against it. But when you're talking about primaries in Iowa, New Hampshire, even in South Carolina, the African-American vote is virtually non-existent. So in the end, it's going to be playing to these groups that are fiscally conservative, in this case for Rand Paul, a bit libertarian, motivated individuals, and then, of course, those who want to see a strong defense but maybe not see us in a lot of wars.
Matt, we've got a couple of minutes left. There's so many questions I want to ask, but let me go to something that happened while I was away. You talk about outreach to groups based on race or ethnicity. This whole story about Jeb Bush checking the box Hispanic when he re-registered to vote in 2009. What's that doing? Really? What's that doing to his campaign?
Personally, I think it was a legitimate mistake. I mean, Jeb Bush is a very, very savvy man. I mean, he's very savvy. He would know the silliness of checking Hispanic by his name. Everyone knows he's not Hispanic. The most it does is bring some attention to the fact that he has other members of his family who are Hispanic. I'm seeing right now a sort of a battle between the Democratic forces and Republican forces to bash Hillary Clinton on one side and Jeb Bush on the other. The story about Jeb Bush's wife, which is a completely silly story about how she had somehow bought all this stuff, but she paid it all back. So in reality, there was nothing to that either. I think this is just early silliness. We see it in these early stages of the campaign. I don't expect it to amount to much at all.
So, Matt, we have to ask you, we know it's very early on, only 2 Republicans have actually put their names into the hat, but right now, if you had to call it, who do you think will be the major Republican contender in this race?
Oh, gee.
No pressure.
I've also predicted winners and sometimes not. I think Bush is the front runner right now because he has so much money. Ted Cruz is going to have a lot of money as well. He's already raised $30 million for his various super PACs, which is really amazing. I do think I watch Rand Paul as being sort of an outsider to come in. And, of course, Scott Walker, who's winning these polls early. So I can't really handicap it right now other than to say the establishment candidate, the one the establishment Republican Party is behind, is clearly Jeb Bush. And you're going to see that muscle. It may not work, but you're going to see that muscle at play as he goes through these early primaries.
Interesting, Matt. We thank you for your insights reflecting on that a plethora of 4-letter names to get Bush and Cruz and Paul. They all fit on the back of the bumper sticker, although Jeb isn't really using his last name. Coming up, we're going to talk more about candidates and the Tea Party. Stay tuned.